how to look at the crisis generally, but also to understand the specificities of each crisis. And Sam will start, and we will do as we did with the previous one. So over to you, Sam.
Okay. Thank you, Dinga. Well, given what Dinga said, I was going to get right into this crisis, but let me just say a general thing about how we approach crises. We don't think that there is one law of capitalism that explains every crisis. We think that crises actually have to be looked at. Oh, I'm sorry.
You raise a little bit.
Okay. I'm sorry.
So, sorry.
Okay, good. Okay, put up your hand if my voice starts fading. When we think about crises, we don't start with there being one law of capitalism that explains every crisis. That crises have to be understood historically, which means that you have to look at this as capitalism changes and it's different in terms of the place where the crisis occurs. And when we're talking about crises, we're not talking about the normal ups and downs of capitalism. We're talking about some interruption in the process of accumulation, of investment, that doesn't seem to have an obvious resolution. So we're talking about structural crises, and these are crises that in the West have occurred. We're talking about this being the fourth such crisis, that there was a crisis at the end of the 19th century, there was the Great Depression, there was the crisis of the 70s, and there's this present crisis. And each of these occurs in the context of a capitalism that's quite different. If you're talking about the crisis at the end of the 19th century and comparing it to the crisis of today, you've got the working class completely differently organized with the development of unions. You've got the multinational corporate form and the institutions of corporations being different than they were 100 and more than 100 years ago. You've got finance being different. You've got states being different. You've got global integration being different. So in each case, you have to actually take a look at the particular institutions that exist and find the contradictions as related to the balance of class forces and the institutions and the political economy of that time. And when a crisis is resolved, as those first three crises were, it changes the institutions and the balance of class forces, and it means next time a crisis happens, it's happening in a different context. Okay, that's very general. If people want to raise questions about that, they can, and we can discuss that more. This particular crisis, first of all, started in the US, which is very important. Leo talked about the crises that were happening across the global south and in some cases in the north, but primarily in the global south. This crisis started in the US, but what we're looking at isn't a question of American decline. That's not what the crisis is about. This is a crisis of global capitalism, of all capitalism, not just the US, because of the way it's integrated. It's a crisis that can't be explained, as Marxists often do, by the falling rate of profit. Profits have been relatively high, generally, there's exceptions, and even through the crisis, the worst of the crisis, they stayed relatively high and they're still very high. And some of those profits are even hidden in terms of the high management salaries and corporate executive salaries that have been handed out and are treated as wages, not as profits. So it's not a crisis of profitability. It's been a crisis of finance. And to say that it's that the crisis, to understand this crisis, you have to look at and focus on finance and how finance has changed and the role of finance in the economy, isn't to say it's because finance is speculative, parasitic, and stands outside the economy, even though it is speculative often and it is parasitic, but it's also functional to capitalism. And it's critical to understand that it has been functional to capitalism. It's been something that made globalization possible, because what financial markets do through derivatives is essentially play the role of an insurance policy on exchange rates. You can buy the right to get paid at a particular exchange rate if you pay a certain premium. It's really an insurance policy, and without it, globalization would have been much slower. So finance plays this role in financial markets that industry is involved in very much, that facilitates globalization. But it also has been crucial to facilitating the reallocation of capital. It's very important to reallocation and restructuring capital, and that's fundamental to the development of capitalism. It's been fundamental to imposing discipline, both on workers and on states in terms of global accumulation. And it's been fundamental to the American empire. Finance has been a vehicle for collecting the savings globally of everywhere and giving the American state access to them. And part of this has meant lending to workers to sustain their consumption so that they could sustain imports from China in particular, but from elsewhere. So finance has been functional. And the contradiction isn't between finance and industry. We haven't seen any evidence of that kind of conflict. It's that this kind of very volatile finance is necessary to capitalism, functional to capitalism. That's the contradiction, that this kind of finance that has these risks is fundamental to the system. So we have to understand it in terms of the development of financial markets, which are so integrated and volatile and sensitive to interruptions. This crisis was very much triggered by something that happened in the housing market, and that was related to workers' debt. Workers had been getting more involved. The ratio of workers who have homes in the US has increased, and workers have used their homes as assets. They've transformed them from just being homes to actually being their assets, their primary asset, and they've borrowed on the basis of assuming that their value of their homes will just keep rising, prices will keep rising. When that stopped, when there was overaccumulation in housing and that stopped, which is historically unique, housing prices have always risen. When that stopped, it meant both a collapse in financial markets, because financial markets had been transferring mortgages. They've made them lending and borrowing and mortgages into commodities that you bought and sold. So all these financial institutions were tied into basically betting that mortgages would be a perfectly safe investment, and housing prices would be rising to make them safe. And the idea always was that, unlike other investments that are financial, housing you can always take over if somebody can't pay, so you should be safe. Well, it didn't happen that way. And when the housing market collapsed, it affected institutions, and this had a spiraling effect throughout financial institutions. So there's the financial question, and there was the fact of worker debt, and the fact of worker debt was related to the contradiction of weakening workers. Workers were weakened in terms of their ability to win wages through direct action through the workplace, and workers came to depend more as individuals on borrowing money to maintain their consumption. So it was also linked to this question of the weakness of workers actually became a problem. Unlike the 70s, when the weakness of workers was the problem that had to be corrected. The strength of workers, in the 70s, was a problem that had to be addressed and weakened. Once they weakened them, this eventually also became a problem for capital. In the US, the crisis was stabilized by basically saving the banks, by all kinds of innovation at the level of the Federal Reserve, the kind of innovation that people didn't think would be possible, about the extent to which the Federal Reserve got involved, and also by a significant amount, a very significant amount of stimulus by the American state. And this seemed to stabilize the crisis. It didn't lead to rapid growth, but it seemed to lead to a level of growth that looked like the US was getting out of the crisis. But there are two other stages to this crisis that followed. One was the crisis in Europe, and Europe insisting, as they went through this crisis, led by Germany, that this crisis be used to restructuring, that the crisis not be eased by beginning to stimulate the economy, that it be used to restructure the southern countries that had recently, or for a while, been in the European Union, and that was fundamental. That point of insisting on discipline in the hope that that kind of restructuring might lead to the kind of restructuring that encouraged investment, didn't occur. And that's where Europe is right now, and it still hasn't changed that, and is unlikely to change that unless there is major mobilization of workers from the left. That was one element of what happened. So that aggravated the crisis, that now it also extended to Europe. And there was a sense, and it looked like for a while after 2010, that the parts of the global south at least would remain isolated from the crisis. This was really when the talk about the BRICS being different and rising and becoming a challenger was raised, but it soon proved that this was impossible. They were too integrated, too dependent. They couldn't develop modes of development that rested on what was happening inside their own country. It still depended on what was happening abroad in terms of markets, in terms of commodities, and in some cases in terms of capital flows. So the South is now also in crisis. And what all of this means is that this is a particularly deep crisis. It's deep in the sense of that it's broad. It's covering all parts of the globe. It's deep in the sense of the crisis is profound in each of these countries, and it's been of such long duration already. We're talking about a crisis that emerges 2008, so it's getting close to a decade now, and there hasn't been, there's no sign that it is about to end. It's also overlaps with other crises that are going on at the same time. There's the crisis of, there's the ecological crisis that has been building that aren't directly linked to this crisis. There's the crisis of immigration. There's the crisis of refugees now in Europe especially, but more generally. And there's also the question of a political crisis, because this crisis came after a couple of decades of neoliberalism. So people had already been sacrificing and facing constraints with the promise that some sacrifices were necessary and they would eventually fix things. And in fact, they got worse. And when they got worse, the banks were bailed out. People haven't been bailed out. So there's enormous frustration, anger, and a distrust and skepticism about state institutions and about political parties. So it's also a political crisis in that sense. And then in the case of South Africa, again here, the important point is that this crisis didn't just start with this crisis. South Africa, in a sense, has been in a crisis mode since the end of apartheid, and trying to find a model that could deal with the legacy of apartheid and be a new model of development. So South Africa itself has been in a crisis which this is aggravated, and there's a question, and South Africa has a very high fiscal deficit right now, and there's a question of how it will respond to this over time. I mean, it's hard to imagine South Africa taking away the grants that half the population depends on without incredible instability. So, there is this question of the fiscal crisis. Then finally, it's what Leo raised. There's the left loves to talk about the crisis in capitalism as if talking about the crisis in capitalism does something for us. A lot of times when you talk about the crisis in capitalism, what people really want is to fix it, so they can go back to the past. It lowers expectations. It makes the past look wonderful. If we could only go back to what it was like under Bush or whatever. So having a crisis often weakens the working class, intensifies pressures. It often simply leads to lowering expectations. And there's nothing automatic about a crisis leading to something positive. It's an opening, and it might. And the question we really do have to spend a lot of time talking about everywhere is this crisis on the left of all its institutions. The crisis in unions, even the best unions, the crisis in the movements, which in South Africa were in the upsurge for a long time, but there seems to be a lull, and the question of institutionalizing movements so they don't just become NGOs. It's not a question of just alliances between movements and unions, because both of them have to be changed before the alliance actually adds up to something. And it's a question of the socialist left. What do organizations mean in this period? How do we deal with the new kinds of problems? And the new questions. Just a final note on internationalism. Leo and I insist on emphasizing that the struggle is within each country and within each state. That's who we have to be struggling. And internationalizing the struggle doesn't mean trying to imagine some abstract internationalism. I mean, if there's division in Kosatu, how do you imagine international links between NUMSA and some other country when there isn't unity within the country? How do you imagine links between the North and the South when in the North there isn't unity between organized workers and non-union more precarious workers? You know, we have to recognize that internationalizing the struggle means taking it on within our own space, within our own state. And when we internationalize the struggle at that level, what we're doing is creating space for others to struggle. If Canadian workers can take on these issues, it creates space for other workers. It doesn't mean that we can win the battle within our own country, but it's absolutely fundamental that we take it on. And if we got socialism, it would be an incomplete struggle. It means that we're dependent on workers taking on that struggle elsewhere at the same time. Some workers being inspired by the struggles elsewhere, always learning from struggles elsewhere rather than just romanticizing them and looking for where the next good model is, Venezuela or Cuba or Bolivia or whatever it is, actually realizing the limits there as well and learning from them. So I hope Leo's going to